Just want to make sure everybody knows we're recording so that we can share this out with you and then others that didn't get a chance to join. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know that people are still joining us, but I want to be respectful of your time and get started on time. So welcome to our webinar, Considerations in Applying for Government Grants. So our hope is that we'll be able to answer questions during this webinar that we get pretty frequently when we have clients that come to us looking to apply for government grants. So thank you for being here today. We're really excited about our free webinar series. So if this is the first one that you've attended, welcome. If you've been attending these each month, thank you for doing that. And then we encourage you to look at our website because we do have a free webinar each month that is specifically focused on a topic that we feel will be beneficial to nonprofits that are particularly smaller, may not have a lot of fundraising staff, what we like to call the scrappy organizations doing really big work with not a lot of resources. So my name is Tawnia Wise. I'm the CEO of Wise Resource Development. And I do have a few team members here from Wise that are also on the call. We have Melanie Carroll, Brittany Bannon, looks like Rachel Ossie is with us. We may have additional team members join on the call. I want to encourage them as well as everybody else on the call that if you have thoughts as this goes along for you to join in and share your thoughts with the group. And then also just wanted to make sure to let you know that if you have any questions as we move along, feel free to drop those into the chat. Brittany on our team is going to be monitoring the chat function and let me know if we have questions that need to be addressed as we go throughout the presentation. And then we do have a question and answers time period set aside at the end as well. I do have everybody on mute, so as you've entered, you have automatically been muted, but feel free to unmute yourself if you want to speak up or share or ask questions. So before I get started, I just want to share a little bit with you about our company. So we are your partners in fundraising. So we are nonprofit consultants. We specialize in fundraising and we customize all of our strategies to meet your needs. Knowing that every organization is unique, we also create flexible custom strategies to meet your unique needs. We do a lot of different types of consulting. Some of our biggest service lines are fundraising assessments, grant writing, development planning, capital campaigns, and recruitment. So if you want to know any more about any of those services, please feel free to reach out to us. And we always do free first call consultations to talk through your needs. Also wanted to just encourage you to join our mailing list. So we do have a newsletter that we send out regularly that provides free fundraising tips and ideas, sometimes templates and tools that you can use as well. So encourage you to get on our mailing list. You can see the join mailing list, text WISE to the 66866 number. So what we'll cover today is we're going to answer these questions as we go through the training. So when you're considering applying for government grants, we'll answer the question or have you think through considerations on, is it worth it? Can you afford it? Do you have the tools and capacity to manage the government grant if you were to get it? Can you commit to the requirements if you were to get the grant? And then we'll talk through steps to help you get ready so that you'll be more quickly able to respond if you see a government grant application that you would like to submit. If y'all know how to find the raise your hand button on your screen, or if I can see your face, I'd love for you to raise your hand and just let me know, or even drop in the comments if you have ever, or if you currently have a government grant. Okay, anybody applied for a government grant in the past? Okay, so a few people have. Okay, well, that's great. I just wanted to find out how many people have gone through this experience before. So let's talk about why you would apply for a government grant. They can build organizational capacity. So government grants can be kind of catalytic funding for a nonprofit, especially if you are doing a program and you want to be able to expand or grow that program. It also can be, it can create sustainability for a program. So, it's like getting long-term funding. So often you can get a government grant that might commit to 3 years. That can be typical, or, sometimes when you do get a government grant, they tend to, as long as you're doing everything you're supposed to in meeting the contract for that grant, you can get that renewed, year after year after year. So it can create some sustainable revenue for your organization. It can also be volatile revenue for your organization as well. So it really depends on the kind of funding that you have. And sometimes the winds of change with government can change the direction of how they want to fund programs. And so sometimes you do see situations where organizations that have been really reliant on government grants for many years all of a sudden lose that funding. And if they don't have a backup source, then they're closing that program down, and sometimes even their organization. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword on sustainability. Sometimes that sustainability runs out. It can help launch or expand programming. So if you're trying to launch a new program, or you want to expand your program into a new population, it works really well with this population, but you want to try it out and meet needs for another population, or you want to serve more people. Also, it can add credibility to your programming and your organization's efforts. So, an example of that is that we had a client, one of our very first clients early on, that had for several years really tried to get a City of Plano grant. City of Plano doesn't typically give out big money. So, the grant was maybe, going to be $15,000, but it wasn't really about the amount of money. They felt like having a City of Plano grant would be almost like an endorsement of their program. And so they really felt like it was important to have that money and that funding. So, they ultimately did end up getting that grant, and it's a story of a lot of strings attached to very little amount of money, but for them it was about the credibility, so that outweighed the other strings attached factors. So I want to talk about reviewing an RFP. So when a government grant opportunity opens, that agency will release a request for proposal or request for application. We call them, RFPs just typically, but they can be called RFQs. There's lots of different ways that they are referred to. But when you get that packet or that RFP, you want to review that really, really carefully. So what we typically do when we work with clients that come to us and say, we want to apply for this government grant application, we will look at that very carefully. We spend sometimes 2 to 3 hours reading very carefully, line by line through that RFP, highlighting every important detail that we need to know about requirements for the program, also requirements for the application. So while we're doing that, we're creating a project plan. So I'm going to show you a project plan in a few minutes, but the goal is to make sure that we capture every moving part and requirement associated with not just the application submission, but also the carrying out of the program requirements associated with the grant. So like I said, this can take 2 to 3 hours, and we read not just the RFP really carefully, we read all attachments. So we open every single attachment that they require you to fill out and submit, and we look carefully through that as well. What you'll find is if you don't do that, you'll miss, you'll be blindsided, or you'll miss requirements that are hidden within attachments. So, I have a few examples of that. One is, sometimes an attachment will require additional attachments. So you're filling out an attachment, and then that attachment says you need to attach the 501c3 letter to this. So if you didn't open that attachment and read that, you wouldn't have known that you need to also prepare additional attachments to go with that. Another example is that sometimes those attachments will surprise you with, you need to attach MOUs or memorandum of understanding, or whatever your agreements are with your partners, that you need to attach those. Sometimes they'll say that you need to attach letters of recommendation. So again, if you don't go very carefully through the attachments and make sure there aren't additional requirements kind of buried into those attachments, then you could get to the submission, closer to submission and realize, oh my gosh, we don't have these attachments and we don't have time to get those together. So make sure that you review every document associated with the grant very carefully. What we find is that, if our clients do a really quick review, which, it's a lot of words in an RFP. So, you want to kind of scan through really quickly, quick review, they'll come to us and say, we're qualified, let's apply. But after we spend, our 2 to 3 hours kind of going through that RFP with a fine-tooth comb, creating the project plan, we go back to our clients and we say, we just want to make sure that you understand, here's the project plan, here's everything that we need to do over the next couple of weeks to get this submitted. So making sure that you are prepared for that. We share other considerations with them, and some of those we'll go through, or we'll go through most of those within this webinar. And we also make clear to them any requirements that they have to be able to commit to receive this grant funding. So whether it's program requirements, financial requirements, whatever that might look like, we make sure that they understand and that they can make that commitment before we start on an application. And so sometimes after a deep review, the response is more like, wait, we don't want to apply for this. So that's why spending a few hours on a deep review of an RFP is really important. As I mentioned, we always create a project plan. So here's an example of a project plan that we've created for one of our clients that we were working on a government grant application for them. So you'll notice that it includes the task, who's responsible, the deadline for that task, the status, and then the notes section. So we put everything in here. So if there is any moving part associated with this application, we put it in here. So you'll notice, you know, everything from forward DUNS number. These are applicable. Are these requirements applicable? And here's the link. So we're going to check on this link and talk through that. So we put everything in here, anything that has to be done and any deliverable. We always suggest that for government grant application, you have a project manager for that. Usually that's whoever is your grant writer, but somebody needs to be responsible for making sure that this project moves forward. So you'll notice that deadlines really have more to do with, you know, the runway to the actual submission. So this is only just a small bit of our project plan, but if you were to go farther down, you would see the deadline. So all of these deadlines ramp up to the grant submission deadline. And so we just make sure that this moves forward. You'll see that we are always tracking status. You know, these are the items that are complete. These are in progress. This has been requested. So at the end of the project, when the grant has been submitted or the application has been submitted, this will all say complete. The project plan also assigns responsibility, makes it clear who's supposed to be doing what. When we serve as project manager, we always make sure that the person responsible for that task has whatever they need, and we get it as far as we can so that we kind of handhold and walk them through making sure they have what they need to get that task completed. Consider as you're creating your project plan, when you have MOUs, letters of recommendation, those can take a long time to get. So, you know, we want to have at least a week out from the grant application deadline that we are requesting letters of recommendation and MOUs from our partners. And what we typically do and what is helpful to get a faster return on those MOUs and those letters is creating basically a template or a draft letter or a draft MOU, and then sending that to them to tweak and edit, put on their own letterhead, and then send back to you. So that way you make it as easy on them as possible to get that letter back to you. So let's talk about, is it worth it? So we always, like I said, we look through the RFP very carefully, and then we come back to our client with things that they should consider before they take that leap in applying. So one of the factors is it enough money? So, you know, if you're launching a new program, consider, will the funding being offered be enough to support that program? So, you know, if you know that it's going to take $100,000 to launch a new program, and this grant funding is $50,000, you know, you might want to consider, are you going to apply for that only if you know where you're going to get the other 50,000? Or is this original 50,000 that if you do get this government grant, can you leverage that to get additional funding? But just making sure that it's enough money to cover what you need it to cover. Also, is it enough money to justify the time and resources that are wrapped up into the application and the reporting requirements? So, you know, sometimes our clients will bring, usually it's city grants to us and say, oh, this looks great, we want to apply for this. And then we'll come back and we'll say, well, the max is $50,000 and it's going to cost you probably $5,000 for us to write it. And then, you know, you have to have a match, and, you know, you're going to have all these reporting requirements. Are you sure that you want to do this? And so we really want to ask those questions because it's really important to think through, is it enough money? I mentioned earlier the client that we had that applied for the City of Plano grant, where, you know, they get between 10 and 15,000 each year, and the reporting requirements are very laborious. And even the application process is is one of the most laborious that we do on our end to help support a client. And truly, it takes us about 40 hours to work on a government grant application, which is about $5,000 of client money. So when we write that application for them, it's that the money that they get in is truly a wash. It's not enough to really justify all the resources that go into applying and administering it. But again, the credibility that they felt like that gave their program outweighed all of those other considerations. But you want to really think through, is it enough money? Also consider how competitive is it? So is there enough available money to make it worth it? And we see this sometimes with city applications where they'll have something like, you know, $200,000 to give out, and it's going to be they're going to give it in 4 chunks of $50,000. And you know the space that and the other competitors for the application, it's going to be very competitive, and it's just not a lot of money that's being offered. So you might want to take that into consideration when you do apply. Also, if you know enough about that funding opportunity to know that it's grant funding that's tied up into existing grantees and multi-year funding situations. So for example, when I used to work in-house at Volunteers of America, Texas, we had housing programs. And so, we wanted to apply for COC funding, but found that those funds were so wrapped up in existing grantees that there really wasn't a lot of opportunity for new grantees to come in and get that funding, especially if the funding source is shrinking. They're going to give kind of preference to their existing grantees. And so if there's not a lot of opportunity, then you may not want to apply for that. Also, on the flip side, we had a situation with a client where they wanted to apply for VOCA funding, and that's Victims of Crime funding. And we just happened to know that the year that they were applying, that pot of money grew and that they had more funds to work with. So they were really encouraging new agencies to apply. And so they kind of had this golden window of opportunity to apply for that funding, and they did get it. And for them, that was catalytic funding for their agency. So if you know about what's happening with the funding source, that can be a consideration in applying. Also consider, is it a clear alignment with your goals? So, ask yourself, does this align with our goals? Do we have to create new programming? Do we have the capacity to do that? Does this funding cause us to change the strategic plan, our strategic plan to fit this funding? We often find that nonprofits want the government grant funding so much that sometimes they embark on mission creep in order to chase those funds. So, this type of thing really does make that funding agency nervous. So, as an example of this, we had a client, we were actually doing an assessment on their organization and found that they had submitted 3 grant applications to the same funding source for 3 different programs that they were creating from scratch for this funding opportunity. They didn't have any history of doing this type of programming, so they didn't have any real qualification. Would have a hard time demonstrating qualifications to do this type of programming. So these were applications that were submitted to the Bureau of Justice, and I'm sure that agency thought, well, this is interesting. Look at this organization that wants to create programs just to get funding from us. And so That is really a red flag to funders if you're embarking on that kind of mission creep where you're basically creating entire programs just to get a funding source. So you want to be really careful about that. And you also just want to make sure that you're holding firm to the identity of your organization, and not kind of morphing or changing your identity just to receive funding. Also keep in mind, does it align with your revenue goals, or does it make you overly reliant on a funding source? So, I've worked at organizations before that are heavy grant funded, government grant funded, and that's restricted funding. So if you are overly reliant on that funding source to do your programming, and then you lose that funding source, you have to really think through, are you okay with the fact that the program's attached to that government grant, and when you lose that government grant, you may be forced to shut down that program? And does that align with your overall kind of revenue goals for your organization? Also keep in mind this last point, do you have the resources? So writing a government grant application is extremely time consuming. When we work on one with a client, just our time alone is typically about 40 hours. And that includes the, writing the content, but also navigating through all of the moving parts of an application. So it's extremely time consuming. That doesn't even include the time that our clients spend on it. So keep that in mind on the time if you're going to put into this. Also, if you don't have at least 2 weeks of a head start on the deadline, then you may not have the time to put into getting it done. Also consider prerequisites like a SAM.gov registration. So this is typically required for most state and federal grants, and some federal money runs through the state and is administered by the state or local administrative agencies, but it's federal money. So anytime you're talking about federal money, usually you have to register at sam.gov, and that registration process can take up to 2 weeks to just get that process taken care of. So there's sometimes kind of time intensive prerequisites that go into being able to submit an application. So as I mentioned, considering do you have time to get your grants package ready to submit? If you know that you'll be applying for government grant funding someday, just kind of getting all your ducks in a row to be ready to do that. And I'll talk at the end of this training about how you can be prepared so that you're ready to jump on opportunities. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is no wiggle room on the deadline with government grant applications. So I'll give you an example of that. We had a client several years ago where, we put in, like I said, 40 hours into this grant application. They were truly a shoo-in to get this money. It's almost like the grant was, the RFP was written specifically for them and their program. So they had a really good opportunity, and their staff was to submit it, and this was going to be a hard copy submission to the agency in downtown Dallas. And that staff person printed everything out, rushed over there last minute, got there 5 minutes late, literally 5 minutes late, and that application could not be submitted. So to this day, they rue the fact that another competing agency got that funding, and that was, again, catalytic funding for that competing agency that put them in a completely different level and playing field than this agency that was our client that missed the deadline. So keep in mind, deadlines are not flexible for government grants. I mentioned earlier, city grants are kind of an interesting situation. We did have a client recently that asked us to review a city grant for them. Sometimes city grants are, their RFPs are very specific. And what they're trying to do is achieve a very specific goal that the city has. And often they have in mind who they want to fund. So sometimes they write their RFPs specifically with in mind who and what they want to fund. So you might look at something and think, this is interesting. Why does this have these specific requirements or this specific amount of money? So for this particular situation, this was a city RFP that was sent out. And if I remember the terms right, it was something like $200,000 was available, and they would give the grant out to up to 4 agencies and up to $50,000 for each agency. So they were very specific in how they would provide those funds. And it was for a program to create digital access navigators. So people who were, it was their job to help people learn how to use digital resources and access digital resources in specific communities. So when we were reviewing this, you know, one of the conversations that we had with that client was, you know, you have to be kind of careful about an opportunity like that, because, you know, even if you get that $50,000, if it's not supplementing an existing program and you have to build a new program around that, $50,000 is not going to be enough to build a new program. And so it really came down to, you know, in my opinion, that RFP was either short-sighted and they didn't understand that nonprofits would need more than that in order to be able to launch a program like this, or they had a specific agency in mind that they wanted to fund, that they knew was already doing this programming, and that they just wanted that this extra $50,000 would help them serve more people. I mentioned earlier, you know, about money chasing. So this is just something to be really mindful of. I think that, you know, we've seen this several times, and I mentioned the one client that sent 3 different applications to the Bureau of Justice. But we also have had clients that were a startup. They were doing some programming. They didn't really have a lot of revenue yet, and so they were really kind of looking at opportunities to create their identity around. So, you know, that is kind of a dangerous place to be in, because again, when you wrap your entire identity up around a government grant and you're that reliant on that revenue source, when that goes away, so will your organization, unless you take really intentional steps to diversify your revenue streams while you have that funding. So you really want to think through that. It's also, honestly, it's kind of a red flag for not, you know, for those funders. So keep that in mind. You don't want to have your entire organization's sustainability wrapped up in a government grant. Also keep in mind that when you are a brand new agency and you haven't really established yourself in your program area, and you can't demonstrate impact in that area of programming, and then you apply for an application for government funding, it is a pretty big long shot that you'll get that funding, because you know, they're not as likely to fund an organization that does not have a proven track record. Also keep in mind, so I want to talk through, you know, can you afford it? So these are really important considerations with government grant applications. You know, it might look like, oh, great, there's this big pot of money. I could get $200,000 to do this programming. However, many government grants have a match requirement. So typically this is 20%. And what this means is that you can use either cash or sometimes volunteer hours for the match requirement. If you use volunteer hours, there's a lot of you have to be really good at time tracking with volunteers and really good at utilizing volunteers and having volunteers work for your agency in order to use volunteer hours. Most agencies use cash as the match, but that just requires tracking existing resources. So I think that's something to really keep in mind. Also note, you have to have in your mind and know where that 20% is going to come from, because that truly is a requirement. So for instance, if you get a $100,000 grant, and you have committed, so you have to get, 20,000, you might look at it like, okay, if I get $100,000 from the government and I have committed 20% match, so that's $20,000 I have to bring to the table. That government agency considers their grant to be $120,000. So you are committed to a $120,000 project and managing a $120,000 project. So your match is considered part of that grant contract. Also, most government grants are reimbursement grants. So that means that you have to submit documentation of expenses before you can get paid. So that means a couple of things to keep in mind. One is you have to have the money up front. So you have to have kind of enough of a pot of money to be able to pay for those expenses up front and then wait to get reimbursed. And then reimbursement is based on your record keeping and making sure that you've kept good records and that you submit the expenses appropriately and timely to get reimbursed. So there's a lag time. It could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, 90 days, and sometimes that gets held up based on your record keeping and your submission. So keep in mind that you have to consider, can you afford to have that much money up front before you're reimbursed? Also, the lag time can be really painful, and if there is a government shutdown and your grants are tied to federal spending or federal dollars, and you require those to operate, I will tell you, at my last in-house position, we operated some community reentry programs where we were relying on federal funding. And when the federal government shut down, it took us months to be reimbursed for those activities. And that's not the kind of programming you can just shut down. So if you can't just stop programming on certain programming or certain programs just because the federal government has paused paying you for them. So, if you don't have enough money in reserves to be able to keep going in that situation, then you're going to be in trouble. Also, I keep mentioning expense tracking. You have to maintain meticulous expense tracking to get reimbursement. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more. But this can cause cash flow issues, and you need to have strong reserves. Another important consideration is, do you have the tools and capacity to manage this grant? So your financial systems have to be pretty robust in order to manage government grants. So the federal government has actually, in their grant application, started to require that you confirm during the application process that you have proper financial systems in place to manage the grant award. So what that means is, can you manage direct and indirect costs? Can you track expenses by class and subclass? Can you track budget versus actual? So for instance, if you're using QuickBooks, is your budget built into QuickBooks so that you can post and run reports of actuals to budget figures? So it really is, you have to be able to track restricted grant funds, And you also have to be able to have reports or be able to generate appropriate reports on how you've spent the grant funds. It may require a complete overhaul of your accounting system. So, I mentioned earlier the client that we got VOCA funding for, they got that funding and then they spent the next year redoing their QuickBooks system because they had to change the way they were doing their financials in order to manage that. And so I think that's such an issue for nonprofits that's why the federal government is making that clear up front with the grant application that you have to have these systems in place. So if you don't already have them in place, you need to get them in place. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how do I do that? Reach out to us. We can point you in the right direction of somebody that can help you do that. It may also require getting a new bookkeeper or somebody who has more experience with this type of managing financial controls of restricted grant awards. And then the other thing to keep in mind here is time tracking. So this is very important. If you have an employee that any part of their salary is covered by a government grant, you have to track their time, 100% of their time. So say, for instance, you have 20% of their time billed to this government grant, you have to track 100% of their time, report that to the funder, and it has to show and reflect that 20% of their time has been spent on that grant. And if not, you won't be reimbursed the full grant budget for that person's salary. Some of our clients will, to try to make life easy for themselves and totally get this and would suggest this, will have an entire employee's salary covered by a grant. So 100% of their salary is covered by that grant. That makes time tracking easy, but keep in mind that if 100% of that person's salary is covered by this grant, 100% of their time must be spent on this grant. That means no side projects, no other, like they don't get to do anything else. They work on this grant. So time tracking is very important, and considerations on how you're gonna, utilize those funds for employee salaries. Program impact, same consideration. You're going to have a robust client management software. You're going to have to be able to track outputs, outcomes. When you have a government grant, you are committing in your contract with them to meet certain numbers. And so you have to be able to track those numbers that you've promised. You also need to be able to track demographics. And so usually your reports are quarterly. It's really important that you're able to, show the impact and track that appropriately. You must stay in compliance with the grant to receive your reimbursement. So if you, for instance, if in addition to hitting your numbers, you may be required to be compliant on other things as well, like staff training, CEUs, licensure. So so you need to be able to track and make sure that your employees have the appropriate licensure or the appropriate training that they need, and be able to report that back to the funder. If you can't do that, it will put you out of compliance and you will not be reimbursed grant funds. And then you just have to make sure that you have the proper processes and mechanisms in place to be able to meet the compliance requirements. If you're out of compliance, what does that look like? So, I will tell you that when I worked for a large organization that was primarily government grant funded, when our programs were out of compliance, and that was, it was programmatic compliance requirements. So it was there were requirements about the way that the program operated, staff training and licensure, things like that. So when the program became out of compliance, that government funding shut down until compliance was reinstated. So just keep in mind that that money is tied to specific program compliance. Can you commit to the requirements? So I've talked a lot about requirements and the strings attached, but there are a few, I just want to touch on again. With the program requirements, we did have a situation that I'll share with you not that long ago for a client that it was actually a collaborative project. So there were a few different agencies that came together, and we were working for one of them, kind of the quarterback or the umbrella agency, and they had two partners, and so we were writing the grant application, explaining how all these partnerships work, and all agencies had supposedly reviewed this grant opportunity very carefully. We were in kind of a crunch situation, so we're moving very fast. And it wasn't until we got to the very where we were putting everything together for submission and getting signatures on some of the attachments where it had a program requirement of a housing first model. And so, if you are familiar with that, then you know that it says that you will house first and then assess needs and barriers later. For this particular client, they house youth. And so they weren't able to commit to that policy, that they really did need to, for the safety of the people that they were serving, assess some things like addiction and some of the potential dangers before just housing somebody. And so they couldn't commit to that. And that was a requirement of the grant. So you really do need to make sure that whatever they require that you follow, that you can commit to that. Also consider the legal requirements, like limitations on lobbying, things like that. That there may be other legal strings attached to those funds. Also keep in mind that that typically for federal grant applications, the board has to approve submission. So the funder often will want a board resolution that is signed by the board chair attached to the application to show that the board approved and agreed and understands the liability associated with these grant funds. And one of the things that I think boards often don't recognize is their own personal liability associated with an organization, and that they do have to promise as board members, as the highest leadership of the organization, that those grant funds will be spent as promised. And if they are not, that they will ensure that those funds are returned. Okay, so what do you need to do to get ready? So if all of this didn't scare you off and you're still really excited about government grant opportunities, what can you do now to make sure that you're ready when an opportunity does arise and you want to be able to jump on it quickly? So here's the things that you need to do. Complete your SAM.gov registration. So this is just really good to make sure you have this done. As I mentioned, it can take a while to get this approved, and you will need this registration renewed annually. So just make sure that this is always current. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask us. But that is just basically, it's almost like the federal government's background check of your agency. Get your financial and program tracking systems ready. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of tracking required. So if those two systems are not ready, get them ready so that you can not just feel prepared to apply, but be ready to track the funds and the programming once you get those funds. Also, just make sure that you have board buy-in and approval. So if it is, if you do hope at some point to be able to apply for government grants, just make sure your board's on the same page with that intention, and talk through that with them. join listserv. So, if you are wanting to make sure you keep an eye out for appropriate government grant opportunities, just make sure that you join their mailing list so that you're getting notifications of those potential awards or those funding opportunities. And then I just would say be discerning. So as you review those opportunities, I mentioned a lot of different things to keep in mind as you're considering whether or not it's a fit for you. So just, have discernment as you're reviewing those opportunities. And now we have 9 minutes left for questions. So I don't know if anybody's dropped questions in the chat or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, Stefan.
Tawnia, so when it comes to tracking the time for the staff people, how does that look like? Is it just like a percentage, or do we need to track like from 8 a.m. until 12 noon they spent this time on that, and then from 1 to 2? How detailed does time tracking need to be?
It should basically be like a time. I would utilize a time tracking software where they're logging in and out, and basically they have to put their activities in. There has to be a way that they can track their activities. And Melanie, did you want to respond to that, because you raised your hand?
I was just going to chime in, having most recently been in an agency that had a very large VOCA grant. It is very, very time consuming. We did not have the time tracking software. So for the 20 staff that we had on that grant, we had to come up with custom timesheets for every one of them in Excel. The timesheets then have to get approved by the government agency, and then you have to track it down to like minutes. It's not broad. And so and that can vary. VOCA tends to be pretty specific on theirs. So some of them might not be as stringent, but it is very specific. Like, they can't count when they're in a staff meeting because that's not directly related to the program. They can't count, when they're on their lunch. They can't count drive time. So they're very specific. So it just takes someone who you have to be able to train your staff up front, and you have to stay on your staff because they have to be good with tracking their time. It can't be something you do at the end of the month. So it can be done, but it's cumbersome, and you have to have a dedicated staff to track it.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Other questions?
I have a question, and I'm not sure if you guys can answer it. It's kind of veering off from the subject matter, but okay. I'll ask it anyway because I think you guys are experts. So I am a new firm, and I was wondering if you guys had any insight on best practices or best way forward to try to get a subcontract on someone who was granted a government contract. Can that be done on after that contract has been granted to said organization, or does that communication and relationship have to be established before the contract is received? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And so I don't know if you already have a partnership in mind for that, but yes, you can get, it depends on the terms of the grant award and contract, but some grants can have sub-grantees. And then, it's really the primary grantee's job to select the sub-grantee, make sure that sub-grantee aligns with all the requirements of the grant, and then also all the tracking and all of that. So sometimes the sub-grantees, I would say probably most of the time, they need to have their own SAM.gov registration, and probably have to go through some kind of approval process. It really depends on the granting agency and the terms of the grant, but typically, just because funders do recognize the fact that sometimes, even if you submit a grant application and there are certain sub-grantees that are outlined in there, and those relationships exist when they get the grant, the world's an ever-changing world. So they understand that sometimes they'll lose subgrantees, have to find a new, partner. So it is not unusual for them to pick up new subgrantees or partnerships in an existing grant, if that's your kind of your primary question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, good questions. Any other questions that you might have for us at this time? Okay, well, thank you so much. We are available, please feel free to reach out to us if you do have additional questions. We're happy to answer those for you and be a resource to you in your nonprofit management and fundraising needs. So appreciate you so much, and thanks. Hope you'll join us in our next webinars. Hope you have a good rest of the day.